Night had always been Nolene's shield. Its darkness gave her the only protection she could trust. But on this night, even the shadows felt thin, as if danger pressed through every crack in the world. Her legs burned from running, her breath tore raw at her throat, and her satchel, once filled with her family's belongings, hung, almost weightless, at her side. Every step she took away from the smoking ruins of her village felt both necessary and impossible. She was alive, yes, but the cost of that survival gnawed at her ribs like hunger. When she finally saw the outline of a barn against the moonlit horizon, she nearly collapsed in relief. It wasn't large, and from the sagging roof shingles and warped boards, it looked half forgotten. Perfect, a place no one would think to look. A place where she might hide for a few hours, just long enough for her pulse to steady and her mind to stop replaying the screams she had been powerless to silence. She pushed the heavy door open just wide enough to slip inside. The interior smelled of old hay, dust, and wood warmed from a long day of sun. Horses were absent. She checked twice, but there were faint signs of life: buckets, brushes, tools neatly organized on the far wall. Someone maintained this place. Someone nearby would wake soon. But exhaustion weighed on her too heavily to keep moving. She found a corner behind a stack of hay bales and curled into it, hugging her satchel to her chest. Only then did she allow her eyes to close. Dawn arrived silently, painting faint gold across the barn floorboards. Nolene didn't stir until the distant creak of footsteps approached, steady, confident, unmistakably male. Her eyes snapped open. Her fingers tightened around her satchel. For one heartbeat, she considered bolting out the back, but her legs trembled even at the thought. She pressed deeper into the hay, breath shallow, praying whoever entered wouldn't look too closely. The barn door slid open with a rough scrape, letting in a wash of morning light. A tall figure stepped inside, boots thudding lightly, pausing as if listening to the stillness. Nolene had encountered cowboys before, some indifferent, some dangerous. This one moved with a kind of quiet certainty, like someone who carried his strength without needing to prove it. He walked toward the horse stalls, humming softly to himself, unaware of the girl hidden only a few yards away. Nolene dared a peek. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and wore a weather-worn hat tipped low over steady eyes. His hands were large, but gentle as he checked the buckets, as if he was used to caring for creatures more skittish than she was. But then he stopped. He didn't turn, didn't speak, just stood as though he felt the air shift behind him. Slowly, he pivoted toward the haystack. Nolene's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced to run, to fight, to beg anything. The cowboy stepped closer. "I know you're there," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was calm, almost steadying. Nolene rose just enough for her eyes to show above the hay. For a long moment, neither spoke. His gaze swept over her hunger-hollowed cheeks, her torn dress, the fear she failed to hide. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head reflexively, though her entire body told a different story. He studied her carefully, respectfully, then did something she didn't expect. He removed his hat, pressing it against his chest. "You're safe here," he said softly. "Ain't nobody gonna harm you under this roof." It was the first kindness she had heard in weeks, and it was enough to make her stay still, trembling, but no longer ready to run. Calder Hart had always been a man who spoke little and acted even less unless something truly mattered. But the moment he saw the Apache girl's terror, real terror, the kind that lived in the bones, he knew this was one of those rare moments when a choice would define everything that came after. Nolene kept her back pressed to the barn wall, if she expected him to drag her out into the sunlight and hand her over to whoever she was running from. But Calder had seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize someone escaping it. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself so he didn't tower over her, his voice low and steady as he asked her name. She didn't give it, just stared at him with wary eyes, clutching her satchel like it was the last piece of her soul she had left. Calder didn't push. Patience was something ranch life had taught him well. He simply nodded and told her she could rest a moment longer, that she was safe for now. But as he rose, footsteps echoed outside, boots crunching gravel, the sound of two ranch hands heading toward the barn. Calder didn't have time to explain anything before the men stepped inside, pausing when they spotted Nolene crouched in the shadows. Their expressions shifted instantly: surprise, then suspicion, then something sharper. One of them muttered that Indians had been stealing cattle north of the valley. Another reached toward the revolver on his belt, and that was when Calder acted without hesitation, moving in front of Nolene with a protective instinct he didn't fully understand yet. "She's with me," he said, his tone firm enough to still the air, his gaze cutting off any argument before it could form. The ranch hands exchanged looks, confusion mixed with disbelief, and one asked if Calder was sure, if he even knew who she was. Calder didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. Something in his gut had already decided. "She's not a threat," he said, "and she's not to be touched." His words carried a weight that silenced the men more effectively than a drawn gun. Still, the doubt simmered. He could feel them. Bringing an Apache girl onto a ranch full of restless, armed cowboys during a time of tension was inviting conflict, but Calder also knew he would rather face all of them than abandon a wounded woman who had clearly run through hell just to breathe. When the ranch hands finally left, muttering under their breath, Calder turned to Nolene again. She was trembling not with fear of him, but with bewilderment at the protection he'd given so freely. He told her she could stay as long as she needed, that no one under his roof would lay a hand on her. His voice was gentle but resolute, a promise carved into the air. Nolene didn't answer, but her eyes softened, the hardness around them cracking just slightly. Calder offered his hand not to pull her up, but simply to help her stand if she chose. For several seconds she stared at it, as if weighing a lifetime of danger against one unexpected act of kindness. Finally, slowly, she took it, and in that quiet moment, Calder understood that he hadn't just sheltered a stranger hiding in his barn. He had chosen to stand between her and the world, no matter what it cost him. Calder didn't expect Nolene to follow him to the house, but she did slowly, hesitantly, like a wild creature testing the air for danger with every step. The ranch yard was quiet except for the soft cluck of hens and the creak of the windmill turning in the morning breeze, yet Nolene kept glancing around as though the world itself might leap at her. Calder walked a few paces ahead, not reaching for her, not rushing her, simply giving her space to decide whether she truly trusted him. When they reached the porch, he paused at the door and nodded toward the inside. "You can rest here," he said, and when she didn't move, he added softly, "No one will bother you in my home." That seemed to reassure her more than anything else he had said. She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the modest room: rough wooden floors, a large stone fireplace, shelves lined with books, a kettle still warm from his morning coffee. It was simple, but everything smelled of warmth and safety. Calder moved toward the kitchen, gathering ingredients for breakfast, but Nolene stayed near the door, unsure if she had the right to move further. He noticed and motioned for her to sit at the table. She obeyed, though the chair creaked under a light weight as if surprised by someone sitting so delicately upon it. Calder cooked in silence, but it was a comfortable kind of quiet, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the hiss of biscuits baking in the pan. He wasn't used to company, certainly not the kind that watched his every motion with wary fascination, but he found he didn't mind it. When he set a plate in front of her, biscuits, eggs, and a cup of water, she hesitated for several long seconds before taking a bite, as though afraid she might be punished for eating too much. Calder pretended not to notice the way her hands trembled, or the way she blinked rapidly when the warm food touched her tongue. He simply sat across from her, eating quietly, giving her the dignity of pretending everything was normal. As the minutes passed, some of the rigid fear drained from her posture, replaced by a fragile calm. After breakfast, Calder brought out a small saddle blanket and placed it on the table. "Need it fixed?" he said, pushing a needle and thread toward her. "You any good at mending?" It was a lie. The blanket was perfectly fine, but he needed to give her something to do, something that made her feel like more than a burden. Nolene's fingers traced the fabric, and something softened in her expression. She began to sew, quick and precise, her movements practiced. Calder pretended to busy himself with chores, but he watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing how her shoulders loosened as she worked. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Why help me?" she asked. Calder didn't answer right away. He picked up a piece of rope and began coiling it, his voice low when he finally replied. "Because someone should." It wasn't a dramatic answer, but it was honest. Nolene absorbed his words slowly, as if unused to kindness without strings attached. Later, he showed her the horses, big, gentle creatures who snorted softly at her presence. She touched one carefully, whispering something in Apache under her breath, and the horse lowered its head as though recognizing her spirit. Calder watched with a faint, surprised smile. In that moment, the ranch didn't feel like just his anymore, and for the first time since finding her in the barn, Nolene looked like she belonged somewhere. Not quite home yet, but no longer a ghost drifting through the edges of the world. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, but beneath the quiet, something unspoken trembled between them, a tension made not of fear, but of truth waiting to surface. Nolene knew she could not hide her past forever, and Calder knew that whatever had driven her into his barn was not something small or ordinary. One evening, after the horses were fed and the sun sank behind the hill of a wash of orange and purple, Calder found her sitting near the corral, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the fading horizon as though searching for someone she knew would never return. He approached slowly, easing down beside her without crowding her space, and for a long while they simply sat there, the silence carrying the weight of two different lives shaped by loss. When Calder finally spoke, his voice was low, gentle, and patient. "You don't have to tell me anything," he murmured, "but if something's after you, I'd rather know what I'm standing against." Nolene didn't answer at first. Her fingers twisted the edge of her skirt, her breath shaky, as if the words caught in her throat were barbed. But the warmth of the evening, the softness of his tone, and the steady presence of a man who had offered her nothing but protection finally loosened the knot inside her chest. She began to speak, not quickly, not fluently, but in halting, trembling truths. She told him about the raid, not by rival tribes as settlers often assumed, but by a band of bounty hunters who had attacked her family's small winter camp, slaughtering them for a reward placed on any Apache they could eliminate. They had shot her brother first, her father last. She had only escaped because her mother had pushed her beneath a fallen log, whispering one final command: "Run." As she described the blood, the fire, the screams carved permanently into her memory, her voice cracked, but she didn't cry, not until Calder reached over, hesitated, and then gently rested a hand over hers. That small touch broke whatever strength she had been clinging to. Tears streamed down her cheeks silently, and she turned her face away as though ashamed to let him see her grief. Calder didn't pull her into his arms or offer empty promises. He simply stayed beside her, hand steady on hers, grounding her pain rather than trying to erase it. When she finally caught her breath again, she explained that the same bounty hunters were still roaming the valleys, looking for anyone who escaped to finish their job. She was the last witness, the last survivor. Calder's jaw tightened as she spoke, the muscles beneath his skin flexing with restrained fury, not at her, never at her, but at the men who called murder a profession. In that moment, Nolene learned something about him too. Calder told her about his sister, a girl with laughter like wind chimes who died during a harsh winter when help arrived too late. He spoke of the helplessness that had carved a hollow behind his ribs, a place that never fully healed. Nolene listened quietly, realizing that the grief he carried had shaped him into the kind of man who could not turn away from suffering because he had once been powerless to stop it. Their stories, though different, intertwined like two broken branches, leaning on each other for strength. When the wind grew cooler, Calder finally spoke again, his voice edged with a calm, fierce resolve. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Whatever's coming, it won't reach you here." Nolene turned to him, eyes rimmed with red, but shining with something new: trust. For the first time since the night everything was taken from her, she felt anchored, not just sheltered, and Calder, watching her in the twilight glow, understood that protecting her was no longer just a choice. It was a promise stitched into his very bones. In the weeks that followed their shared confessions, something subtle but undeniable shifted between Calder and Nolene, not in grand gestures or spoken declarations, but in the quiet ways two wounded souls began to orbit each other with a natural, unspoken rhythm. The ranch, once just a patch of land Nolene sought for shelter, slowly became a place where she planted new roots without realizing she was doing it. Every morning she rose before the sun, stepping barefoot into the soft earth as she greeted the horses with whispers in Apache, words meant to soothe and honor them, and the animals' creatures who sensed hearts more than appearances responded to her with gentle nudges and soft whinnies. Calder watched from a distance at first, leaning on a fence post with his coffee in hand, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he witnessed how easily she restored calm to a ranch that had always carried a quiet loneliness. He didn't interfere. He simply let her grow into whatever space felt safest, and she did slowly, cautiously, but steadily. The ranch hands, who once eyed her with suspicion, began to soften too. Jake, the oldest of them, discovered she could braid rope faster and neater than anyone on the property. Lee, the youngest, laughed the first time she flicked water at him during chores, a tiny spark of playfulness he never expected from the silent girl they had once feared. Nolene, though still shy, started responding to their kindnesses with small nods, shadows of smiles, or the simple offering of sharing tasks without being asked. Calder made sure none of the men crossed lines. His presence alone was enough to maintain respect, but he also let her form her own place among them, never caging her under his protection. And Nolene felt that difference deeply. She wasn't being kept. She wasn't being hidden. She was being welcomed, allowed, trusted. At night, she often helped Calder in the kitchen, chopping vegetables or stirring stew, while he stoked the fire. Their conversations were soft and sparse, yet meaningful. She taught him Apache words: "Chiz" for firewood, "Ashla" for 5, "Shah" for my son, though her voice cracked slightly when she realized she had accidentally spoken a word from her childhood. Calder, in turn, taught her the names of clouds and constellations, the quirks of the ranch animals, the stories carved into the land he worked every day. Sometimes they ate in silence, but it was a silence stitched with comfort rather than fear, a companionable quiet that felt increasingly like a home being built piece by piece. Yet despite the warmth growing between them, Nolene kept her bedroll neatly stacked in the corner of the spare room, as though she never quite believed she deserved to stay. Calder noticed. He noticed everything: the way she lingered at the doorway of the house before stepping inside, the way she paused when laughter bubbled unexpectedly from her chest, the way her gaze sometimes drifted to the horizon with a flicker of guilt, as though she worried her happiness was borrowed, temporary. One evening, after a long day of branding cattle, Calder found her sitting on the porch steps, weaving a small leather charm with careful fingers. When he asked what it was, she told him it was meant to protect her home from danger. "Your home?" he asked gently. Nolene hesitated, her dark eyes lifting to meet his. "A home," she corrected softly, almost shyly, as if hoping but not daring to assume. Calder didn't push her. He simply lowered himself beside her, their shoulders brushing lightly, and after a long quiet moment, he said in a voice roughened by unspoken emotion, "It's yours if you want it." She didn't answer in words. She didn't need to. The way she leaned ever so slightly into him was enough for both of them to know that the ranch was no longer just his, and her life was no longer something she had to survive alone. It was becoming. The ranch had settled into a fragile, precious piece, a rhythm Nolene had come to treasure. Yet peace, she knew better than anyone, was a thin thread easily snapped, and the day it snapped began like any other, with the sun warm on the fields and the sound of horses nickering at the fence line. Nolene was helping Lee mend a broken gate when she saw Jake galloping in from the ridge, his horse lathered and breathless, urgency written across every line of his weathered face. He barely slowed before shouting for Calder, and the moment the name he carried reached Nolene's ears, Dawson, the bounty hunter who had led the raid that destroyed her family, her entire body went cold. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her breath tightening, as though the ghosts of that night had crawled out of the past to wrap hands around her throat. Calder reached her in 3 long strides, steady hands gripping her shoulders, his voice firm yet gentle. "Look at me," she tried, but fear dragged her gaze toward the horizon, where dust clouds rose, riders moving fast, too fast for anything but violent purpose. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that they weren't just passing through, they had come for her. She whispered the name that haunted her dreams, and Calder's jaw hardened instantly. She could see the shift in him, the rancher turning into the protector he had always been beneath the surface. "You're not running," he said, not as a command but as a vow. Not this time, not alone. But Nolene's instinct was to flee, to vanish like she had been trained since childhood to survive by movement, not by standing her ground. Panic clawed up her throat. "They will kill you," she choked out. "They will burn everything." Calder touched her cheek with the gentlest sweep of his thumb, a contrast to the fire sparking in his eyes. "Let them try," he said. "They won't touch you, not while I breathe." He called the ranch hands together, men who had once doubted her, but now stood ready to defend the land she had breathed life back into. Calder armed them, issued terse orders, and stationed them at fences, porches, and ridges. He placed Nolene inside the house, insisting she stay sheltered, but she could hardly breathe in the stillness, pacing like a caged animal, the rumble of distant hooves drew closer. Memories flooded her mother's last cry, her father's fall, the heat of burning hides, and guilt crushed her until she could barely stand. She slipped out the back door, determined to run and draw danger away from the ranch, but Calder was already there, blocking her path, breath ragged from searching for her. "Don't," he said, voice low, steel wrapped in softness. "I'm not losing you, not to them, and not to fear." His words broke something open in her, a realization that she was no longer a ghost drifting through survival, but a woman someone wanted to fight for. Before she could respond, the first shot cracked through the valley, echoing like a war drum. Calder pulled her behind him as the bounty hunters crested the hill, their silhouettes framed by dust and hatred. Jake and the others returned fire, the ranch exploding into chaos, but Calder's focus was singular: keep Nolene alive. Though terrified, she grabbed a fallen revolver with shaking hands, her breath steadying as she whispered a prayer in Apache for courage. She wasn't the girl who hid under a log anymore, and when Calder looked back at her, pride flickered in his eyes, because he saw not a refugee, not a burden, but a fighter standing at his side. "You said." The battle at the ranch gate erupted with the fury of all the ghosts Nolene had been running from, the valley echoing with gunfire and shouted orders as dust churned beneath pounding hooves, and for a moment the world became a blur of smoke, heat, and memory. Calder fired with grim precision, each shot a shield between Nolene and the men who had carved her life into scars. But Dawson, the monster who had led the raid that destroyed her family, rode with a chilling calm, his eyes locking onto her as though she were a prize he had already claimed. Nolene's breath hitched, terror threatening to cripple her. But then she felt Calder's hand brush her back as he reloaded, not to push her away, but to steady her, to remind her she wasn't facing this night alone. Jake and Lee held the flanks, shouting for cover, while ranch hands she'd barely spoken to now fought like men defending something sacred. Bullets tore splinters from the corral fence and sent clouds of dirt spraying around them. Calder took a hit to the shoulder, stumbling, but he gritted his teeth and kept firing, refusing to fall. Nolene darted to his side, grabbing his arm, not to drag him away, but to anchor him, her hands slick with sweat and shaking with adrenaline. He met her eyes just long enough to see the determination burning there. This was no longer the fragile girl who hid in hay. This was a woman reclaiming her life by force if she must. When Dawson's men began pushing closer, Nolene's instincts kicked in. She snatched a rifle from the ground, her fingers remembering the weight and balance from childhood lessons taught by her father. Lessons meant for hunting deer, not men. But tonight, Survival blurred all boundaries. She took a breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The shot rang true, striking one of Dawson's riders and sending him crashing to the ground. Calder cast her a look of startled pride, quickly masked by urgency. Together they retreated toward the ranch gate, its wooden frame battered, hanging crooked, yet still standing like the land's final line of defense. Dawson dismounted, approaching with slow, deliberate steps, his revolver drawn, his smile the same one he'd worn the night he burned her world. "Thought you got away, little doe," he drawled, voice thick with cruelty. But even strays come home eventually. Nolene's hands trembled not with fear, but with rage so deep it felt like fire rising from the earth itself. Memories flashed behind her eyes, her father's laugh, her brother's teasing grin, her mother's final push that saved her life. She stepped forward before Calder could stop her, raising the rifle with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I'm done running," she said, her voice low but ringing with truth. Dawson chuckled darkly. "So you wanna die brave? I'll oblige." He lifted his gun, but Nolene was faster. Her shot struck his arm, spinning him off balance. Calder surged forward, tackling Dawson before he could recover, the two men crashing to the ground in a brutal struggle. Dust rose in thick clouds as they fought, fists thudding, boots scraping, Calder's blood smearing into the dirt. Nolene stood frozen for a heartbeat, every instinct screaming to help, but fear of hitting Calder held her still until Dawson broke free, swinging his revolver toward Calder's chest. Without thinking, Nolene launched herself forward, grabbing a discarded tomahawk from the ground one Calder kept as a tool, not a weapon, and brought it down across Dawson's hand with a cry torn from the deepest part of her soul. The gun clattered away. Calder shoved Dawson back hard, pinning him with a knee as Jake and the others rushed in. With the threat neutralized, silence fell heavy across the ranch, broken only by Nolene's ragged breathing. She stared at Dawson helpless. Now, furious still, and for the first time, she felt the past loosen its grip. Calder rose slowly, reaching for her, his voice hoarse. "You did it," he said, awe and relief woven into every word. Nolene collapsed into his arms, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming truth washing through her. She had finally stopped hiding. She had fought, and she had won. When the dust of the battle finally settled and the valley fell into a bruised, aching silence, Nolene stood in the center of the ranch yard, feeling as though her soul had been wrung out and left raw beneath the open sky. Dawson was bound, the last of his men driven off, and the ranch hands moved with weary relief, tending to the wounded and the frightened horses. But Nolene felt suspended between two worlds, the one she had lost and the one she didn't yet believe she deserved. Calder leaned heavily against the porch rail, his shoulder wrapped and blood seeping slow but steady through the bandages Jake had tied. And though exhaustion dragged at every inch of him, his eyes never left her, not once, not even when his knees threatened to buckle. Nolene approached him, and one walking toward a cliff she might fall from, her breath uneven, her hands still stained with dirt and the remnants of a life she had fought tooth and nail to reclaim. "I should go," she whispered, the words barely audible, but heavy as stone. Calder's brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in a deep, quiet hurt she hadn't expected to see on the face of a man who never let emotion crack his composure. She looked away before she could drown in it. "Those men came for me. This ranch, this life. It was never meant to hold someone like me. If I stay, I bring danger. I bring trouble." Her voice broke, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of believing she didn't belong anywhere. She turned toward the barn, toward the place she had first hidden, the place she thought she might disappear from without leaving a footprint behind. Calder pushed himself off the railing with a soft hiss of pain, forcing his battered body to move. He followed her, steps uneven but determined, and when she reached the barn door he caught her wrist gently, not to restrain her, but to anchor her. "Nolene," he said, her name a low, rough echo in his throat. She didn't turn fully to face him. She was afraid of what she'd see, afraid of what she wanted too much to trust. "I can't stay where I don't belong," she murmured. Calder moved closer, his breath warm against her temple, his hands sliding from her wrist to her trembling fingers, holding them with a reverence that undid her completely. "You think I let you walk into my home, my life, my days," he whispered, "just to watch you walk back out again." She closed her eyes, fighting the sting of tears. He gently guided her to face him, his thumb brushing away a tear before she even felt it fall. "You don't hide here anymore," he said softly, the same words he had spoken the day he found her, but deeper now truer. Then he drew a slow breath, eyes searching hers with a tenderness so raw she felt her heart split open. "Come home with me, Nolene. Not stay here, not be safe, not don't go. But come home, a choice, a future, a place, a life." Her breath shattered in her chest as the meaning wrapped around her, as the months of fear, wandering, and loss finally cracked into something gentler, something like hope. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his uninjured shoulder, feeling his arms slide around her, with the careful strength of a man holding something he never intended to let break again. And in a whisper shaped from both surrender and rebirth, she said the word she had not spoken since the last night she saw her family alive. Yes, under the bruised sky of the ranch that had once been just another hiding place, Nolene chose not to run, not to disappear, but to stay, and in staying, she found home.